In the quiet suburban community of Clearwater, Florida, life once moved at a slow and predictable pace. Neighbors knew one another, lawns were neatly trimmed, and the houses all seemed to echo the American dream. For years, the Wilson family had been part of this landscape, representing a picture of stability and normalcy. Thomas Wilson, the father, was a hard-working electrician who often came home late but always made time for his only son, Ethan. His wife, Margaret, a homemaker who later worked part-time at a local bookstore, had a reputation for being warm, approachable, and deeply devoted to her family. Together, they built a life centered around their modest two-story home on Oak Ridge Drive, where the walls carried decades of photographs, laughter, and the memory of milestones. The Wilson household was far from perfect, but it had its rhythm. For Ethan, their son, the house was more than just a place to live. It was a physical reminder of the bond he once shared with his parents. Family dinners, Sunday afternoons working on car repairs with his father, and holiday gatherings became memories etched into the corners of the home. Even after Thomas's sudden death in 2018 from a heart attack, the house remained a sanctuary for Ethan. He was only 11 years old when he lost his father, but the structure of the family home gave him a sense of continuity, grounding him during a time when grief threatened to swallow him whole. Margaret, however, experienced that grief differently. Losing her husband at 44 left her feeling adrift, burdened with both financial and emotional responsibilities she had not been prepared to shoulder alone. She tried to keep the family intact for Ethan's sake, but as the years passed, she began to seek companionship. By 2021, she started dating a man named Richard, a real estate consultant who promised her a fresh start away from the shadows of her late husband. Richard encouraged Margaret to consider selling the house, arguing that it held her back, keeping her tied to the past. To him, the walls were not filled with warmth but with sorrow, a reminder of what she had lost. Margaret, increasingly drawn to Richard's vision of renewal, began to believe him. For Ethan, who by then was in his late teens, the idea of leaving Oak Ridge Drive felt like betrayal. Every corner of the house was a monument to his father. The garage still smelled faintly of motor oil, his father's tools hung neatly on the wall, and the living room shelves held old baseball trophies from a league Thomas once coached. Selling the home meant dismantling everything that connected Ethan to the man he missed every day. It was not just real estate, it was memory, history, and identity. Losing it would mean losing his father all over again. As tensions grew between mother and son, Margaret's relationship with Richard only deepened. By early 2023, she began openly discussing her plans to relocate with him to a different city. Neighbors occasionally overheard arguments coming from the Wilson house, Ethan's voice raised in desperation and Margaret's firm insistence that change was necessary. Though no one thought much of it at the time, those disputes would later be remembered as the seeds of something far darker. Behind Ethan's quiet demeanor was a storm brewing. Outwardly, he was a typical 18-year-old. A recent high school graduate with average grades, no trouble with the law, and no history of violence. But inside, resentment festered. He saw his mother's decision not only as abandonment but also as erasure, erasing the life he cherished with his father, erasing the stability he had fought to hold on to, and replacing it with a future he did not want. Margaret's growing distance from him, emotionally and physically, only fueled his isolation. The Wilson family, once a portrait of small-town American resilience, was now fractured in ways the neighbors could not see. From the outside, the house still looked the same. White siding, blue shutters, the front porch swing that Thomas had installed himself. But behind closed doors, unspoken grievances and unhealed wounds were eroding the foundation. It was in this fragile environment that Ethan began to feel cornered, convinced that his mother's choices would soon strip him of everything that mattered. What no one realized at the time was that this emotional turmoil was not simply grief or teenage rebellion. It was the prelude to an irreversible act of violence that would shock Clearwater and send ripples across Florida. By the beginning of 2023, the Wilson household no longer resembled the haven it once had been. Tension lingered in the air like humidity on a Florida afternoon, thick, unavoidable, and suffocating. Margaret had grown increasingly decisive about her future with Richard. Conversations with friends often centered around moving plans, new neighborhoods, and the excitement of a fresh start. Meanwhile, Ethan's unease transformed into a silent defiance. To those outside, he was quiet, polite, perhaps a little reserved. But at home, he had begun to withdraw, spending more time locked in his room, headphones on, and his laptop glowing late into the night. Neighbors had noticed subtle changes. Margaret was no longer as friendly at block gatherings. She seemed preoccupied, frequently seen on her phone in long, private conversations. Ethan, once known for shooting hoops in the driveway or walking the family dog, now rarely interacted with anyone. While these observations raised mild curiosity, no one suspected that the mother-son conflict was building toward something catastrophic. In fact, if asked, most neighbors would have described the Wilsons as just another family going through growing pains. Yet inside Ethan's mind, those growing pains were taking shape as betrayal. He had tried to reason with his mother in the months prior. He reminded her of his father's love for the house, the effort it took to buy it, the years they had poured into turning it into a home. He even begged her to delay the decision until he could at least find his footing in adulthood. But Margaret's response remained steady. The past was the past and she wanted to move forward. She framed the house as a weight, an anchor dragging her down when she desperately wanted to rise. For Ethan, those words cut deeper than she realized. To him, the house wasn't an anchor, it was the only lifeline he had left to his father. The relationship between Margaret and Richard only sharpened the divide. Richard, nearly a decade older than Margaret, had his own ambitions. He encouraged her to see Ethan as overly sentimental, perhaps even manipulative in clinging to the home. He painted Ethan's resistance as immaturity rather than grief. Margaret, tired of carrying the emotional burden of single parenting, found Richard's perspective comforting. She began to lean on him more heavily, not realizing how alienating it was for her son. By February 2023, arguments in the Wilson home became routine. Ethan accused his mother of erasing his father's memory, while Margaret insisted that her decisions were about survival and happiness. Some nights, their disputes escalated into shouting matches that ended with slammed doors. Other nights they barely spoke at all, the silence just as damaging. Richard's presence, sometimes in person, sometimes through Margaret's constant texting, only widened the rift. Ethan grew convinced that his mother had chosen Richard over her own family, over him, over everything his father had built. At the same time, Ethan's isolation was reinforced by technology. He turned to the internet not for distraction but for escape. What started as aimless late-night browsing soon turned darker. He stumbled across forums and articles about poisons, reading with a mixture of fascination and dread. Search engines became his confidants. Questions like how to make someone sick without being caught, or poisons that look like natural illness, appeared in his history. He didn't think of himself as violent, at least not at first. But as days turned into weeks and his resentment toward Margaret hardened, these digital searches became something more deliberate. Meanwhile, Margaret saw her son's withdrawal but interpreted it as typical teenage behavior. She assumed he was simply struggling with the transition into adulthood, perhaps sulking over the loss of routine after high school. She occasionally tried to talk with him, but those conversations quickly dissolved into conflict. Ethan's bitterness made it hard for him to articulate his pain in a way that his mother could accept. She mistook his silence for stubbornness when it was, in truth, a buildup of anguish she never fully grasped. March brought more concrete decisions. Margaret officially listed the Oak Ridge Drive house for sale. She spoke excitedly with Richard about viewing properties closer to Tampa, where Richard's business contacts were based. Ethan overheard conversations about square footage, school districts, and future plans that no longer included him. Each mention of selling the house felt like a betrayal repeated over and over. To him, it wasn't just real estate listings, it was a countdown to the destruction of his father's memory. By mid-March, the Wilsons' dynamic had reached a breaking point. Margaret was determined to move forward with her life, while Ethan, unable to accept her vision of the future, felt cornered. He confided in no one. Not friends, not teachers, not relatives. His growing obsession with poisons became his dark secret, something he carried like a weapon in his pocket long before it materialized. Each day he watched his mother make plans with Richard. The thought solidified in his mind. If he could not stop her with words, he would stop her with action. The Wilson story, on the surface, still looked like an ordinary family navigating grief and change. But beneath that facade, Ethan was descending into a place of dangerous resolve. What began as arguments about selling a house had mutated into something far more sinister. A plan that would soon shatter not just a family but an entire community. And while Margaret dreamed of new beginnings, her son was already sketching the outlines of a fatal end. On the morning of April 10, 2023, Clearwater woke up to another humid Florida spring day, the kind where the sun rises early and the air feels heavy with promise. Inside the Wilson home, however, the atmosphere was far from promising. Margaret had just returned from a weekend trip to Tampa with Richard, and her mood was buoyant. Over breakfast, she began to outline her plans to finalize the sale of the Oak Ridge Drive house. She told Ethan that the realtor had already received serious interest and that by summer, they would likely be moving. For Margaret, it was good news. For Ethan, it was the breaking point. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring into his cereal bowl, his jaw tightening with every word his mother spoke. She described Richard's vision for a new life, a townhome closer to the city, modern amenities, a fresh start where she could finally breathe. Margaret's voice carried an optimism that Ethan hadn't heard in years, but to him, it wasn't joy, it was betrayal. He clenched his spoon so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with something Margaret had never seen in her son before: contempt. "Dad built this house," Ethan muttered, his voice low but trembling with anger. "He died here. And you're just going to throw it away for him?" He gestured toward her phone, where Richard's name was lit up with another incoming message. Margaret sighed, already exhausted by the argument she knew was coming. "Ethan, your father is gone. Holding on to this house isn't going to bring him back. We need to move forward. You need to move forward." Her words were firm but not unkind. She believed she was teaching her son resilience, not realizing that to Ethan, it sounded like she was erasing his father altogether. That breakfast conversation became the spark that ignited the plan Ethan had only fantasized about in dark corners of his mind. For weeks, he had been reading about toxins, browsing obscure online forums that offered detailed instructions about substances that could mimic natural illnesses. He had even located a vendor on the dark web who claimed to sell small quantities of lethal chemicals disguised as household products. He had not yet acted, but Margaret's announcement that the house sale was imminent flipped a switch inside him. If he did nothing, he would lose everything that tethered him to his father's memory. To Ethan, the solution became terrifyingly clear. His mother could not be allowed to leave. The following days unfolded with deceptive normalcy. Margaret continued planning the move, meeting with the realtor, exchanging texts with Richard, and packing up old boxes in the attic. Ethan, meanwhile, began to execute his plan. Late at night, he used his laptop to place an order for a substance he had read about extensively: thallium, a highly toxic compound once used in rat poison but now tightly controlled. It was odorless, tasteless, and notoriously difficult to detect without specialized testing. The vendor promised discreet shipping within 2 weeks. Ethan sent cryptocurrency payment and waited, his stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and dread. While waiting for the package, Ethan rehearsed his rationale in his mind. He told himself he wasn't a killer. He was a son trying to protect his father's legacy, trying to preserve the only home he had ever known. He convinced himself that Margaret had chosen Richard over family, and by extension, over him. The poison, he reasoned, would be justice, a way of stopping her from tearing down the life his father had built. In his mind, he wasn't destroying his family. He was saving it. By April 25th, the discreet package arrived. It was delivered in a plain cardboard box, indistinguishable from any other online order. Ethan signed for it casually, his hands trembling as he carried it upstairs. Inside was a small vial, sealed and wrapped in layers of protective plastic. He held it up to the light, staring at the clear liquid that would soon alter the course of his life forever. That night, alone in his room, he opened the vial, dipped a cotton swab into the liquid, and watched it glisten. He felt powerful, as if he finally held control over the fate that had been slipping away since his father's death. The first opportunity came just 2 days later. Margaret was in the kitchen, preparing tea before bed, a nightly ritual she had adopted since Thomas's passing. Ethan, claiming he wanted to join her, offered to make the tea himself. He carefully measured the dose he had read about online, enough to cause symptoms but not immediate suspicion. He stirred the poison into her cup, his hand steady despite his racing heart. When he handed her the steaming mug, she smiled faintly, unaware that her son had crossed an irreversible line. The effects were not immediate. At first, Margaret experienced vague symptoms: nausea, fatigue, and mild headaches. She assumed it was stress or perhaps a stomach bug. She brushed it off, continuing her plans with Richard and ignoring Ethan's unusual attentiveness. But Ethan watched closely, his eyes flicking to her every time she coughed or winced. He began to feel both guilt and satisfaction, a twisted combination that kept him awake at night. He would pace his room, torn between the urge to confess and the compulsion to continue. Over the next several weeks, Margaret's health deteriorated. She grew weaker, often complaining of joint pain and blurred vision. She visited a local clinic on May 7th, where doctors ran routine blood tests but found nothing conclusive. They prescribed rest and hydration, assuming it was viral. Margaret followed their advice, but her condition worsened. Richard grew concerned, urging her to seek a specialist, but Margaret insisted it was nothing serious. Ethan, meanwhile, quietly increased the dosage in her tea, always careful to adjust based on the symptoms he observed. By mid-May, Margaret was nearly bedridden. Her once vibrant personality was overshadowed by fatigue and confusion. Ethan, now consumed by his role, alternated between playing the concerned son and the cold executor of his plan. He brought her meals, fluffed her pillows, and encouraged her to rest, all while secretly ensuring that her decline continued. Richard visited often, but Ethan resented him more than ever, viewing his presence as both intrusive and threatening. He knew it was only a matter of time before Margaret's condition became undeniable. The breaking point came on May 22nd, when Margaret collapsed in the kitchen. Richard, who had stopped by unexpectedly, found her on the floor and immediately called 911. Paramedics rushed her to Morton Plant Hospital, where doctors admitted her in critical condition. Initial tests pointed toward heavy metal poisoning, but it would take time to confirm. Ethan stood quietly in the corner of the hospital room, his face a mask of worry, his heart pounding with the knowledge that the investigation had now begun. When Margaret was admitted to Morton Plant Hospital on May 22, 2023, doctors were puzzled. Her symptoms were severe: hair thinning, extreme fatigue, abdominal pain, and neurological issues. But the root cause was elusive. Her vitals fluctuated wildly, and despite supportive care, her condition continued to deteriorate. Within 48 hours, a toxicology screen revealed traces of thallium in her system, a discovery that immediately changed the trajectory of her case. Thallium poisoning was rare, virtually unheard of in modern times due to its strict regulation. Its presence was not just unusual, it was suspicious. The hospital staff notified the Clearwater Police Department, and soon, detectives were dispatched to speak with the family. The lead investigator, Detective Laura Hernandez, was a veteran of the department with more than 15 years of experience in homicide and unusual death cases. She arrived at the hospital on May 24th, observing Margaret in her hospital bed, frail and barely responsive. Richard was at her side, holding her hand, visibly distraught. Ethan sat quietly in a chair near the corner, his face pale, his expression carefully neutral. Detective Hernandez began with routine questions. She asked Richard about Margaret's recent activities, diet, and medications. Richard explained that Margaret had been experiencing unexplained symptoms for weeks, but they had assumed it was a viral illness. He expressed frustration that doctors hadn't identified the issue sooner. His concern seemed genuine, his voice breaking as he described Margaret's decline. When asked if he had noticed anything unusual at home, he shook his head emphatically. Turning to Ethan, Hernandez shifted her approach. She noted his silence and asked how long his mother had been unwell. Ethan's answers were clipped, delivered with the monotone of a teenager weary of adult interrogation. He claimed he had noticed her fatigue in late April but thought it was stress from the house sale. When asked if he had prepared meals or drinks for her, Ethan hesitated slightly before admitting that he often made her tea at night. The detective made a mental note of his hesitation, though she did not press further in that first conversation. The rarity of thallium poisoning demanded immediate escalation. Samples were sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, toxicology lab for confirmation, while investigators began piecing together Margaret's final weeks. Detectives searched the Wilson home on May 26 with Margaret's consent, combing through the kitchen, bathroom, and storage areas. They collected cups, tea canisters, and cooking utensils for analysis. Nothing immediately pointed to contamination, but the absence of an obvious source only deepened their suspicions. Detective Hernandez also ordered a digital forensic review of Margaret's phone and computer. She wanted to see if Margaret had accidentally encountered thallium through work, hobbies, or online purchases. That angle quickly dead-ended. Margaret's digital life was unremarkable, filled with realtor emails, text messages to Richard, and online shopping receipts for household items. But when Hernandez requested access to Ethan's laptop, which was sitting quietly in his bedroom, the tone of the investigation shifted. At first, Ethan resisted. He claimed his laptop was private, filled with schoolwork, personal chats, and video games. But investigators obtained a warrant, citing the unusual nature of the poisoning and Ethan's proximity to his mother's daily routines. On May 28, FDLE's cybercrime unit imaged the device, beginning a thorough analysis. Within days, incriminating evidence began to surface. The search history was damning. Phrases like, "how to poison someone without getting caught," "symptoms of thallium poisoning," and "by thallium online," appeared in his browser logs, dating back to early April. Investigators also discovered bookmarked pages from forums discussing poisons and their effects, some of them written in disturbing detail. The most damaging piece of evidence, however, was a cryptocurrency transaction record linking Ethan's account to an anonymous vendor on the dark web. The transaction date matched the timeline when Margaret's symptoms first appeared. Detective Hernandez and her team moved cautiously. While the evidence was mounting, they needed to confirm the physical connection between the purchased substance and Margaret's illness. Toxicologists at FDLE worked to match the chemical signature of the poison in Margaret's blood to the vial that had been shipped. On June 2, investigators returned to the Wilson home with another warrant, this time focusing on Ethan's room. Hidden inside a shoebox beneath his bed, they found the vial, nearly empty but still sealed enough to test. The forensic lab later confirmed it was the same compound detected in Margaret's body. With the evidence piling up, Hernandez arranged a second interview with Ethan on June 5. This time she was less casual. Sitting across from him in a small interview room at the Clearwater Police Department, she laid out the facts. "We know your mother's been poisoned with thallium. We know you researched it online. We know you purchased it and we found the vial in your room. Do you want to explain how all of this adds up?" Ethan sat rigid, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For several minutes he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. He insisted he hadn't meant to kill her. He claimed he only wanted her to get sick enough to delay the move, to make her reconsider selling the house. His explanation was chilling in its cold logic. He believed incapacitating his mother would preserve his father's legacy. Yet as the detectives pressed further, Ethan's story unraveled. He admitted to lacing her tea with the poison, adjusting the dosage over time, and watching her condition worsen. Margaret remained hospitalized throughout the investigation, her condition worsening despite aggressive treatment. By June 10, doctors determined that the damage was irreversible. She passed away quietly that evening with Richard at her side. The news hit Clearwater like a thunderclap. A beloved neighbor, a mother, gone, not from natural causes but from a deliberate act of violence within her own home. The official cause of death was listed as acute thallium poisoning. Within 24 hours, Ethan was arrested at the Wilson residence and charged with first-degree murder. The quiet teenager who once seemed invisible to his neighbors was now the center of a criminal case that shocked the community. The early investigation, which began as a medical mystery, had now laid bare a story of betrayal, grief, and calculated malice. When the news of Ethan Wilson's arrest broke on June 11, 2023, Clearwater was stunned. Neighbors who had watched him grow up, a quiet boy who played basketball in the driveway, who helped his father wash the car, who mowed the lawn every Saturday morning, couldn't reconcile that image with the teenager now accused of murdering his own mother. Local headlines called it the poisoning on Oak Ridge Drive. While news crews parked along the street, their cameras capturing every glimpse of the once unassuming home. Detective Hernandez knew the case was strong. The evidence tied Ethan to the poison, to the laptop searches, and to the vial found in his bedroom. But in her years of working homicide, she had learned that nothing was ever as simple as it first appeared. As prosecutors prepared for trial, her team continued to dig deeper, hoping to uncover every layer of Ethan's motive. That's when the investigation took an unexpected turn. During the forensic analysis of Ethan's laptop, detectives found not only the damning search history but also dozens of private journal entries stored in a hidden folder. They were not assignments or schoolwork, They were confessions, rants, and letters that Ethan had typed late at night. In these entries, Ethan wrote about his hatred for Richard, his belief that his mother was replacing his father, and his conviction that selling the house was like burning a church. But there was something else, something darker. Ethan had not only planned Margaret's poisoning, he had also considered targeting Richard. One entry, dated April 15th, read, "If she goes through with the sale, maybe it's not just her. Maybe it's him too. He's the reason she's doing this. Without him, she wouldn't betray Dad. Without him, we'd still be a family." This discovery reframed the case. Ethan had been motivated not simply by grief or sentimentality but by a growing obsession with eliminating anyone who threatened his version of family loyalty. The prosecutor, Assistant State Attorney Daniel Carter, realized that the evidence now supported not only a charge of first-degree murder but also the possibility of conspiracy or attempted murder. If Ethan had obtained more poison, Richard could very well have been his next victim. When Richard was informed of the journal entries, his reaction was visceral. He had already been wrestling with guilt, wondering if his relationship with Margaret had indirectly led to her death. Now, faced with the knowledge that Ethan may have intended to kill him as well, his grief turned to fear. For days he refused to return to the Oak Ridge Drive home, instead staying with friends outside Clearwater. "I thought he was just a kid," Richard told detectives. "I thought he was hurting. I never imagined he was plotting to kill us both." Meanwhile, Ethan's defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Melissa Parker, tried to craft a narrative that could soften the perception of her client. She argued that Ethan had been driven by trauma, that he was a boy who had lost his father too young and never received the counseling or support he needed. She claimed his actions were not those of a calculated killer but of a grieving son acting irrationally under the weight of abandonment. But the prosecution countered with the digital evidence, the journal entries, and the chillingly methodical way Ethan had increased his mother's dosage over time. The twist in the case came into sharper focus when FDLE investigators traced Ethan's dark web communications further. They discovered that he had corresponded with multiple vendors, not just one, inquiring about different substances, arsenic, cyanide, and ricin. While only one transaction had been completed, the breadth of his inquiries revealed a broader intent. He had not been desperate in a single moment of rage. He had been experimenting, researching, and planning for months, exploring every possible method to carry out his scheme. In court filings released in late June, prosecutors revealed this information to the public. The story exploded in the media. Ethan wasn't just portrayed as a misguided teenager. He was painted as a budding criminal mastermind. Headlines labeled him the boy who shopped for poisons and Florida teen's double life, student by day, killer in training by night. Talk shows debated whether Ethan was a product of parental neglect, untreated grief, or something far more sinister. For Detective Hernandez, the twist was not just about media optics, it was about justice. She had interviewed many suspects over her career, but Ethan stood out. He lacked the bravado of hardened criminals. Instead, he carried a quiet conviction, as if he truly believed his actions were justified. During one recorded interview, when asked why he didn't simply move out or seek independence instead of poisoning his mother, Ethan replied flatly, "Because leaving would mean giving up. And Dad didn't raise me to give up." That statement haunted Hernandez. It spoke to the twisted way Ethan had internalized his father's memory, weaponizing grief into justification for murder. To her, it was clear. Ethan's crime was not a sudden impulse but the result of festering resentment, carefully nurtured into violence. The midpoint of the case brought a devastating clarity. This was no longer the story of a boy accidentally pushed too far. It was the story of deliberate intent, of a teenager who had crossed the line from grief into obsession. The twist lay in the scope of his planning. Margaret's death was not the endgame but the first step in what could have become a broader tragedy. By July 2023, the trial date was set, and the state prepared to argue for life without parole. Ethan's defense insisted he was a victim of circumstance, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Clearwater braced itself for a courtroom drama that would expose every hidden corner of the Wilson family's tragedy, a case that had begun with a sick mother but now revealed the darker truth of a son consumed by rage and obsession. As weeks passed and investigators dug deeper into the mysterious death of Karen Mitchell, the initial grief that swept through the neighborhood of St. Petersburg, Florida, slowly transformed into whispers of suspicion. Neighbors, who had once gathered around to offer condolences, began sharing their observations with each other. Many recalled how Ethan Mitchell, Karen's only son, had displayed an unsettling calmness in the wake of his mother's prolonged illness and eventual death. Instead of breaking down or showing visible signs of devastation, Ethan often kept to himself, staring blankly at the family home as if lost in thought. For detectives, this behavior wasn't enough to draw conclusions, but it added to the growing unease surrounding the case. The autopsy had confirmed traces of a rare toxin in Karen's system, but investigators still needed to uncover how it had entered her body and who had administered it. The turning point came when detectives obtained a warrant to search the family's home computer, a dusty old laptop that had once belonged to Karen but was now almost exclusively used by Ethan. What they found shifted the entire trajectory of the investigation. On the laptop's browsing history, meticulously retrieved by forensic analysts, there were multiple searches dating back months. Keywords like "how to buy poison online," "painless ways to poison someone," and "slow-acting toxins available for purchase" appeared repeatedly. The history also revealed Ethan had visited online forums on the dark web where discussions about obscure chemicals and their effects were rampant. Investigators noted that one particular poison matched the toxin found in Karen's bloodstream almost exactly, a rare compound typically used in agriculture but lethal when ingested by humans. This discovery stunned the investigative team. Up until that point, their suspicions had leaned toward foul play, but now they had tangible proof that Karen's death was not only premeditated but carefully orchestrated. The twist deepened when they interviewed Ethan's friends and classmates at St. Petersburg High School. Several of them admitted that Ethan had been withdrawn in recent months, often making dark, unsettling comments about his mother's choices. One close friend recalled Ethan saying, "She's destroying everything my dad left behind. If she goes through with this, I'll have nothing." At the time, his peers dismissed it as typical teenage frustration, but in hindsight, the remarks carried a chilling weight. Detectives also discovered another layer of Ethan's motive beyond the house and the affair. During a routine background investigation, they stumbled upon Karen's life insurance policy, which had listed Ethan as the sole beneficiary. While the payout was not enormous, roughly $150,000, it was more than enough to provide a tempting incentive for an 18-year-old who felt his world was crumbling. But the real twist in the case came when Ethan himself attempted to divert suspicion. During a follow-up interview with detectives in late September 2019, Ethan tearfully claimed that his mother's boyfriend, David Ross, had been pressuring Karen to sell the house and move away. Ethan alleged that David was controlling and manipulative, and even suggested that David might have poisoned her to push the sale forward without interference. His performance was convincing enough to momentarily plant doubt. Detectives briefly considered the possibility, given David's known conflicts with Karen's son and his eagerness for a new life together. However, the digital trail told a different story. The IP address linked to the poison-related searches led straight back to the Mitchell household, and timestamps showed they had been conducted late at night, hours when Karen was asleep and David had no access to the computer. The most damning evidence arrived when investigators obtained records from an online vendor on the dark web. With cooperation from federal cybercrime units, they traced a purchase order for the exact poison back to an anonymous account. That account, however, was tied to a cryptocurrency wallet funded from a prepaid debit card Ethan had purchased at a local convenience store. Surveillance footage from the store even captured Ethan at the register, nervously paying for the card. When detectives presented this evidence to the state attorney's office in Pinellas County, the case took on a new dimension. What initially seemed like a tragic case of a mother falling victim to sudden illness had now transformed into a chilling narrative of betrayal, greed, and calculated murder at the hands of her own son. The twist was not just in the revelation of Ethan's actions but in the dual image he projected. To the outside world, he was a grieving teenager mourning the loss of his only parent. To investigators, he was emerging as a cold, methodical planner who had spent months orchestrating his mother's slow and painful demise. By early October 2019, the case had captured the attention of local and national media. Headlines painted Ethan as a troubled young man who had allegedly poisoned his mother to preserve the past and secure financial gain. The twist shocked the community, as many struggled to reconcile the quiet, soft-spoken teenager they knew with the portrait of a calculating murderer the evidence suggested. The story had shifted dramatically, and detectives knew the next steps would push Ethan further into the spotlight, and ultimately toward the courtroom. By mid-October 2019, the investigation into the death of Karen Mitchell had reached a critical juncture. Detectives in Pinellas County, Florida, were no longer dancing around suspicions. They were convinced that Ethan Mitchell, her 18-year-old son, was the mastermind behind her poisoning. Yet, suspicion alone wasn't enough. Prosecutors needed an airtight case that could withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom and a jury. The conflict intensified when Ethan realized the walls were closing in. Up until this point, he had maintained an image of a grieving son, dutifully answering questions from detectives while carefully masking his involvement. But the mounting evidence, his internet searches, the dark web transactions, the life insurance policy, formed a damning puzzle. The more detectives pieced it together, the clearer the picture became. Ethan began to sense that investigators were no longer treating him as a witness but as the primary suspect. His interviews grew tense, his demeanor shifting from cooperative to defensive. In one particularly heated exchange on October 14, 2019, detectives confronted him with the browsing history retrieved from the family laptop. Ethan stammered, claiming someone must have hacked into their Wi-Fi or that his mother's boyfriend, David Ross, had used the computer while visiting. His explanations were weak, filled with inconsistencies, and investigators noted his sudden change in tone. Meanwhile, the community's perception of Ethan was unraveling. The media began publishing details leaked from the investigation, describing the possibility that Karen's son had poisoned her over disputes about the family home and her romantic relationship. Headlines in local newspapers like the Tampa Bay Times read, "Teen under investigation after mother's mysterious death tied to poison." Neighbors who once expressed sympathy now looked at Ethan with a mix of suspicion and fear. Parents in the area warned their children to stay away from him, whispering about the chilling idea of a son murdering his own mother under their noses. The legal battle intensified when Ethan's extended family, including his maternal aunt Linda Carter, publicly spoke out. Linda described Karen as a devoted mother who had sacrificed everything for her son after her husband's death. She pushed investigators not to rest until they found justice. Karen deserved better, Linda told reporters outside the courthouse. If Ethan had a problem, there were 100 other ways to handle it. Poisoning your own mother is unthinkable. Her words added emotional weight to the prosecution's case, and the pressure on law enforcement mounted. But the real conflict lay in Ethan's internal struggle. Witness accounts described him as oscillating between arrogance and fear. One of his teachers at St. Petersburg High School later told investigators that Ethan seemed unusually distracted in class, constantly checking his phone and doodling in his notebook. His once mild-mannered personality gave way to outbursts of frustration. The pressure of maintaining his innocence in public while knowing investigators were closing in began to fracture his composure. As detectives built their case, they enlisted cybercrime experts to trace Ethan's online activities even further. They discovered encrypted messages exchanged between Ethan and an anonymous seller on the dark web. In these conversations, Ethan had asked detailed questions about the poison's strength, how much he would need, and how long it would take to kill someone without immediate detection. The tone of the messages was cold and methodical. There was no trace of hesitation or remorse. For investigators, this digital paper trail was the smoking gun. The prosecution's case strengthened even further when a toxicologist provided expert testimony during pretrial hearings. The toxicologist confirmed that the slow, agonizing decline of Karen's health matched perfectly with the effects of the specific poison purchased by Ethan. This testimony made clear that Karen's death was not natural, nor was it accidental. It had been a calculated act carried out over weeks. Ethan's defense team, appointed after his arrest on October 21, 2019, scrambled to craft a narrative that could mitigate the damning evidence. They argued that Ethan was a troubled teenager lashing out over his mother's choices, not a cold-blooded killer. They hinted at possible mental health issues, suggesting that his grief over his father's death and anger at his mother's new relationship clouded his judgment. However, prosecutors countered that Ethan's actions, meticulously researching poison, purchasing it online, and administering it in doses, demonstrated a chilling level of planning inconsistent with temporary emotional distress. The rising conflict reached a boiling point during Ethan's arraignment at the Pinellas County Courthouse. Reporters filled the courtroom as prosecutors laid out the evidence, painting Ethan as a manipulative young man who valued property and money over the life of his own mother. Ethan sat silently, his face pale, as family members of Karen sobbed in the gallery. The judge denied him bail, citing the severity of the charges and the overwhelming evidence. Outside the courtroom, the community erupted in debate. Some viewed Ethan as a monster, irredeemably corrupted by greed and resentment. Others, though fewer in number, argued he was a victim of his circumstances, a teenager pushed to the brink by grief, abandonment, and the fear of losing everything tied to his late father. Regardless of opinion, one fact was clear: the case had divided the community and drawn national attention. The conflict wasn't only about whether Ethan was guilty, but also about what his actions revealed about family, betrayal, and the fragility of trust. The once quiet suburb of St. Petersburg was now at the center of a story that asked disturbing questions. How far can anger drive someone? How much pain can loss truly justify? For Ethan, the rising conflict was personal and unrelenting. As he sat in a jail cell awaiting trial, he grappled with the consequences of his plan unraveling before him. Every piece of evidence, every headline, every tear from his relatives tightened the grip of justice around him. The line between his intentions and the devastating reality of what he had done grew impossible to deny. The stage was set for a dramatic climax, where the full weight of Ethan's choices and the justice system would come crashing down on him. The trial of Ethan Mitchell began in February 2020 at the Pinellas County Courthouse. The courtroom was filled with reporters, grieving relatives, and curious onlookers drawn to the shocking case of an 18-year-old accused of murdering his own mother. From the very first day, the air was heavy with tension. The prosecution presented a meticulous timeline of Ethan's actions: his online searches for poison in the summer of 2019, the cryptocurrency purchase traced back to him in August, and the gradual decline of Karen Mitchell's health that culminated in her death on September 18, 2019. Expert witnesses, including toxicologists and cybercrime analysts, testified that the poison in Karen's bloodstream matched the very compound Ethan had ordered. Surveillance footage from a convenience store showing him buying a prepaid debit card was played for the jury, erasing any lingering doubt about his involvement. The defense argued desperately that Ethan was not a monster but a young man spiraling from grief and fear of losing his childhood home. They painted him as unstable, traumatized by his father's death years earlier, and emotionally devastated by his mother's decision to move in with her new partner. They urged the jury to see him as a broken teenager who had acted irrationally, not as a calculating murderer. But the jury could not ignore the evidence of planning. The cold, deliberate tone of Ethan's dark web messages became the prosecution's most powerful weapon. How much is needed to kill someone slowly without detection? One of Ethan's questions read. When that message was shown on screen, a collective gasp swept through the courtroom. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case was handed to the jury. It took them less than 6 hours to return with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the decision. Ethan, pale and expressionless, stared down at the defense table, avoiding eye contact with his Aunt Linda or the other relatives sobbing in the gallery. On March 12, 2020, Ethan Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in her remarks, called the crime a chilling betrayal of the most sacred bond between mother and child. She emphasized that while grief and anger might explain frustration, they could never excuse murder, especially one carried out with such cold calculation. For the community of St. Petersburg, the verdict closed a dark chapter. Neighbors who had once watched Ethan grow up were left grappling with the realization that beneath the quiet exterior of the teenager next door had lurked resentment strong enough to end in murder. For Karen's family, the trial brought justice, though never healing. In the end, the Mitchell home, once filled with memories of a loving family, stood as a haunting reminder of how quickly love could curdle into violence. What Ethan had tried to preserve, the legacy of his father, the memories tied to the house, was forever stained by the act that destroyed it all.